Right, it's my pleasure for this Women in Rugby League Life with the Lionesses to talk to someone who I have known for far too long. It makes me feel really old when I begin to know how long I've known people. Claire and I met many, many years ago through, actually, it wasn't through a friend, Neil Wood. I think it was first with the Great Britain Lionesses, and then our paths crossed so often with Neil Wood, who was a colleague of mine at the Rugby Football League. And Claire has been an inspiration for Rugby League for a long, long time. Very quiet person who people have never heard of or known the great work that she did. So it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Claire to Life with the Lionesses and to find out more about what you've done in Rugby League.
Thank you very much, Julie. I don't think anyone has ever described me as quiet.
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Maybe that's the right. So, Claire, tell us a bit about your background and how you got involved in Rugby League.
Okay. It's an interesting one. It goes right back to my childhood because my father was a very, very famous in Ireland Gaelic football player. So sport was a very big part of my growing up. And he would have watched any sport, but he particularly liked watching rugby league on the television. So I can remember the days of watching Eddie Waring commentating on rugby league. And I only knew about it from a distance because at that stage there was no rugby league in Ireland. But when I first went to university in Liverpool in the sadly very early 80s, 1979, 80, I met a woman who was inspirational in my life, who was involved with Liverpool University Rugby League team, partly because her partner was playing for the rugby league team. But she had said to me, "Do you want to come and watch a game? Do you want to come and get involved?" And so I did, and I became the Liverpool University Rugby League Club social secretary. It makes me laugh. And so I was responsible for kind of trying to organize people a little bit, which was like herding cats,
I
and
can imagine.
setting up events that raised money for the team to get us around places. And obviously, it was watching men play. But it was really, I found it really interesting. And I met a lot of people, including the person you've just mentioned, Neil Wood, who I've been married to now for a very, very long time. Um, and I think I found it interesting watching as time went on and we moved on from university to he got a job as a development officer in Rochdale, rugby league development officer, one of the first jobs. And I loved helping out with the coaching and watching the coaching. And I decided I was going to get a coaching qualification in rugby league, which there weren't many women doing that at the time, to say the least.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think I might have been the second or third person who did it.
Yeah.
And on the day that I went to do the coaching qualification, I got in the car. We went down to a very cold rugby league ground. And the person doing the coaching course said to me, "Thank you for dropping Neil off."
Classic.
And he said, "Actually, I'm dropping Claire off." Um, and that was interesting because that 2-day coaching course, I absolutely loved it. And yeah, I was given tackling as my little teaching bit, and I'm sure that was done sort of slightly with a bit of malice that I was going to have to demonstrate tackling. But I was friendly with a guy who played for Widnes at the time, Phil McKenzie. So I rang him up and said, "What are you doing tomorrow? Do you want to come?" And I coached the kids with Phil as my assistant. And so I had they all thought it was great that they had this top player actually demonstrating tackling. So the sort of other bit is that I am a qualified clinical psychologist, and I decided what I wanted to do was see how you might apply some psychological principles to sport. So I took a bit of an interest in that, and I don't think many people were doing that at the time,
Mm.
actually. And I got involved with some of the you know the bigger clubs because we had friends who were involved in the bigger clubs and did a whole variety of very odd things, like helping a fullback recover some confidence about catching high balls on the full. I did some work with somebody who was an overseas player that was desperately homesick. And then I did some more team-based stuff. And some of the early team-based stuff I did, which dates back quite a long way now, was with Brian Smith at Hull FC. And so I did a sort of pre-season bit with him. And that was amazing, working with a professional club doing their pre-season training. And then I went on to work a bit with Kevin Tamati at Warrington as well, because he and Brian had chatted about, and it was interesting. The people who were most interested were the overseas coaches.
Yeah.
Because I think they were more familiar with the idea of that being something that was of value. Other people were slightly more suspicious.
Yeah, because I remember, and actually, when you look at the archives, so Jackie's put all her records. Jackie Sheldon, who was a Great
Yep.
Britain coach, women's coach, has put everything into the archives, and we're going through it at the moment. And from my background, which I at the time was going through a sports science degree when all that Great Britain, and when you began to get involved in Great Britain, which we'll come into. But when I look back, I think how revolutionary it was that the team was actually doing, and the stuff they were doing was not being done in rugby league at all.
Nope.
And it was, you were well before your time, as was Jackie, in being able to develop team and on the psychological side, physically, there was things happening in the men's game, but nothing as in depth as what you did with the Great Britain women's team, and I imagine the men's teams as well.
Yeah, and I think it was the difference was the Kiwis and the Aussies were so confident at the time, and they would have used anything that they thought was going to give them an edge, and that included psychological preparation as much as physical preparation. And I do look back on things that Brian Smith did at that time, which were, again, nobody did any of that stuff here, whereas nowadays it would seem quite, normal stuff to do. So yeah, and there's an interesting split, because some people go down the sports scientist route nowadays to become a sports psychologist, whereas I was a clinical psychologist doing some psychological application in sport. But there wasn't any clearer route into it at the time. It was something where I loved the sport, I loved the work I did, and I knew that I could put two of the things together at points in time. And it worked that way. That's the way it grew a bit more organically than perhaps nowadays you would have to do a specific training and go down a specific route.
Because I remember doing sports psychology at Leeds Carnegie and being very specific at that point, and then obviously having a background in clinical a bit, but then it was all about the athlete and how you sort of began to apply it. So how did you get involved at Great Britain then? Great Britain women?
I'm thinking, I have very poor memory of these days, but I think it goes back to, I want to say it was something to do with Ian Harris.
Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, you were involved at Ian Harris's time.
Yes,
I can tell you from all the paperwork.
Well, I think Ian Harris, and I think we knew Ian, and I remember having some conversations with him about the application of psychological principles into rugby league. But also, I think for me, the other bit was I've had quite a strong background in kind of feminism, and I worked in my psychological career. I worked a lot with women, and I used to see that there was so much more potential for women to achieve more in sport than the opportunities that there were, if you know what I mean. That it sort of felt that it was an obvious thing when I heard that there was a women's rugby league, to think, well, that's amazing. I'd love to see what goes on there, and I'd love to get involved in trying to help some of the women achieve greater potential, really. So I think it was Ian Harris might have first introduced me, because I think he was involved in some of the coaching early on.
Yeah, he was he took the 96 tour. He was head coach.
Yeah.
Of which you see, and I've seen your name all over it, so I do know you were there.
I'm glad you could
and
remember.
even photographs of you in the team. So with the
I'd love
team.
to see those.
Yeah. So I know you were very involved beforehand, because the team about 96 tour, so about 94, they were selecting players, and you were involved right from the beginning, really. And Ian was a visionary. as a coach as well, and he, you know, a lot of the work he did, you could see from his work, and he did his masters based on a lot of the work he did with Great Britain women. So really, really fascinating. So I know he did involve you, and then Jackie continued your involvement and bringing in Joe Hudson, who was another psychologist, wasn't she?
Yeah, I remember the sort of selection process work, because we did a lot of stuff. We did a lot of stuff around how do you build a team dynamic, because you were taking, obviously, you're bringing together a group of people who play against each other normally, and you actually want them to start to function really effectively as a team. Which, to be honest, with the women, I found that easier than I've found it with male squads, because I think there is something about, if you're already going to put yourself out there and play rugby league as a woman, you see yourself as part of a community much more than perhaps some of the men players would. They would see each other as much more as rivals. I'm not saying that they aren't rivals once they get on a field. I think they are, but outside of that, there's a sort of more of a community. So I remember being part of the selection process, and that's really complicated, because it's also about how are people going to manage being away from home, how are they going to manage families, because I think it's so much more complicated for women than it is for men, in terms of trying to juggle all the various different roles that they've got. So I remember having a lot of discussions about that with people, but also helping people manage their confidence, their performance anxiety, seeing themselves as good enough to play. There were lots of issues around that, and lots of stuff around helping people just get into that zone of an elite athlete, really. And that was the bit that I thought was really, really inspirational, because I don't think there were many people doing a lot of that with team sports at that point in time.
No, and particularly with women that had come from that community background of playing. And let's be honest with the game, you know, they played rugby, they went out for a beer, and it was a big jump from the expectations of club rugby to, there was nothing in between to that international piece of them suddenly going on to. And a lot of women have spoken about you, whether it be offline or online, around the help you gave them to give them that confidence to be able to perform, and they're really grateful for that, because it really made a difference to them going on to, and the anxiety about going on tour and leaving the families, and actually, you know, you really help them to gain that confidence to be able to, you know, actually achieve that, what they did when they went out in 96. So
yeah, and I think they were so welcoming to me, because as you know, my son Michael reminded me last November, when the World Cup was on, that I dragged my family around with buckets. We did all the collecting money thing. You know, we'd go to games and we'd be allowed to sort of do a bucket collection at the end. And if you think of that, the effort that quite a few of those women had to put in to just raise the money to even buy kit and go on a tour, it's ridiculous, really, when you think of how hard that was for people who weren't always coming from the most you know, wealthy backgrounds, to be able to start from scratch and to build that sort of reputation as an elite athlete, but then also have to pay for themselves to go on the tour, pretty much. And as I say, Mike reminded me that we'd gone to all the various bucket collections, because we often tagged whatever we were doing in training around a game that we could go to as well, and then try and sort of raise a bit of money towards the tour as well. So yeah, it's when I think of the achievement of those women, it's absolutely amazing, really.
yeah, it's phenomenal. And you look at that some of them had never really, you know, been on a plane or left the country, or and actually some were, you know, had young families, so they were coming back into the sport after, you know, having children as well, which was pretty phenomenal as well.
Yeah, I remember doing the bleep test with Brenda Dobeck, and I think she was working in the fire service at the time. I might be wrong about that, but I think she was in the fire service, and she was just unbelievable. I mean, her level of fitness was just off the scale. And I remember it was really nice to be able to quote that to other people when I went back working with men's teams, you know, and say, well, actually, you know, I know some women who could easily do more than you're doing at the moment, because she was just, and she talked about that thing of, you know, you don't just have to overcome kind of those sort of gender stereotypes, but you have to be even fitter to be accepted at that period of time. I mean, I think we forget about some of that nowadays because it was, you know, there were very different standards at that point in time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because what comes out with all the women's stories is there need to be better and fitter, as you say, and it comes out really strongly.
Yeah.
That in order to achieve, and in fact, I've just been going through some stuff today at Heritage Quay where the archives are, and I've been looking through some of the stuff I did, and I said to the curator, they went, "Blooming hell, how many exams and qualifications did I go for in order to be the best referee that I could be?"
Yeah.
You know, the coaching qualifications, the extra conditioning, the counsel, whatever I did was around me being a great referee. That's what I wanted to be,
Yeah.
and that's what you had to do at that time. And actually, when you talk to some women now, it's still the case in a lot. You know, that they feel as though they have to prove themselves constantly.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, I watched the documentary that was on about the women during the World Cup, and again, it's still, I found it really moving because you're trying to compete at that elite level and you have so many other pressures on you as well at the same time. And I'm not saying men don't have that, but I think there's this sort of different mentality of the additional pressures that women have of maintaining a family relationship, trying to do all those sort of nurturing roles, as well as allowing themselves to be nurtured as an athlete and to go on to perform.
Definitely. And it's interesting where psychology has gone with that, hasn't it? And teams, and how integral it is now in team preparation.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually that whole thing about whether somebody's gonna survive on tour or not. I mean, there's some really, really big pressures in that. And I went on to do a tour with the Great Britain and Ireland students. And it was really interesting. We had to send somebody home because they couldn't survive the sort of distance, and that was somebody who didn't have kids at home. So it's kind of, you know, you have a lot of admiration and a lot of admiration for the families that support the women to be able to do it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's come out really loud and clear with some of the interviews. You know, without their family support, they just wouldn't have been able to do it.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
Yeah. So when you sort of look at what you've done, and
Yeah,
if you look at the paperwork, which maybe you need to come in and have a look at it actually and just see the masses of, and it's well before its time. And I didn't realize at the time it was, you know, when you're going through it, because
yeah,
obviously I was very involved with the team. Um, and you didn't realize how far advanced and the team cohesion it created. And when you meet the players now and
mm,
how those friendships have been maintained, I would put down to that work that was done sort of from 96 onwards around the off-field stuff to make them that you know, those bonds even stronger as a team.
well, I mean, it was it. That isn't just me. That was very definitely the whole team of people who were working with the squad. But
Mm.
I did laugh at Lisa Mack reminding me about, you know, she said, I remember lying on a gymnasium floor and listening to you doing relaxation and positive mental rehearsal, and mindfulness. And when you think nowadays that people just think, oh, well, that's really normal stuff. But it wasn't then. You know, to be doing that in a non-clinical setting,
Yeah.
and to be
Yeah.
doing it with, but my experience was, even though people took the mickey out of me quite a bit because they called me the shrink or whatever, they actually were like sponges, and if you were giving them something that they felt that they could use to help them play better, they were great.
Mm.
Really, the one I do remember as well, which was a team building one, was we did I think we're doing, you'll know better than me with looking at those archives, but I think we went to North Wales to do a sort of team building
Mm.
weekend, and I got them all to do a treasure hunt. And the treasure hunt was based on the fact you needed lots of different skills in your group of people, and therefore it meant they had to spend some time finding out more about each other and what skills each other had. And they had a right laugh doing that. It was really good fun.
Mm.
But it was, you know, I was worried as well because they had to collect things, and I was worried what we might have stolen from various places in North Wales. Did have worries about that afterwards, but they'd had a real good laugh doing it, and found out loads about each other and about each other's strengths and weaknesses that weren't just about whether you could play rugby league or not.
And I think that tells now. I know they've been sharing some stuff, and I think it was after your time, but they did lots of work around why do you, like this player, and writing up about how
Yeah,
each player is, and they've been sharing some of that stuff now
yeah.
on WhatsApp, and it's just like it stayed with them,
Oh, it's
that, which is absolutely phenomenal, isn't it? From the work, and as I say, very before its time,
mm,
and how they actually did it. And I think when you get them all together, you see the impact it's still having. The friendships are still there and forged because of that.
yeah, yeah. Well, and the other one I remember doing as well, which was an interesting one, was so I challenged a bit of the thinking around, uh, the way people talk on the field is quite important, and some of the thinking can be helpful and some of it can be very unhelpful. So things like, we're going to make every tackle in this set of 6, and then if you don't make the first one, oh well, what do we do now, because we've lost that goal. So
Mm.
actually setting realistic goals that are actually achievable but drive you forward is quite a challenging thing to do. So instead of saying we're going to make 100% of our tackles, well, what's a realistic target? And then can we up that a bit?
Mm.
But also doing things like trying to see how the team performs, and who are the key people on the field, which aren't always your halfbacks. It can be somebody else on the field who lifts everybody's head when things are tough. Um, and I love all of that because I can see it in action. Certainly in that documentary about the World Cup, you can see that in people. Some people are inspirational,
Mm.
and they'll never give up. And that sort of level of motivation keeps all the rest of the team's heads up when things are tough.
Yeah, absolutely. And being able to recognize it as a team, those that the heads do go down, so the others can pick them up, is just so
Yeah,
important, isn't it?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So when you look back, now I've sort of been diving into everyone's heads and archives about, your involvement. When you reflect on it, what do you look at what you've achieved, and the team, and what you've done?
Um, well, I mean, it's something that I do feel proud of. I feel it's something that, to be in at the start of that process is great. And my big regret is that I couldn't go on the tour, because I would have loved to have actually gone on the tour. But my kids weren't that old at the time either, and we didn't have anybody. We didn't have a lot of support in England. That was the problem. There were people around, but they couldn't have really helped. So I think I look back and I was really proud, and I would have loved to have actually seen it through to that bit of actually going physically on the tour, which I wasn't able to do at that time. But yeah, really proud of it, and fantastic people. I mean, I did laugh a hell of a lot during that period of time, because what I do remember about the women I met was their resilience and their humor, and their, you know, real can-do attitude. It was incredible, really, when you think of the things they had to overcome to turn up at training regularly, to turn up at the selection process, to prepare, to raise the money. I really, really admired the people I was working with, and had a great deal of time for them, because they taught me lots as well. And they certainly taught me loads about rugby league as well.
So when you look at women's rugby league and women's sport now,
Mm.
what do you think about where it's cut? Obviously from those early doors to where it is
Mm.
now. What's your thoughts around it?
I, I'm certainly not alone in thinking it should be fully professional now, because I really do think it's so hard uh, for women to compete in the same sort of arena as, say, the women from Australia, who are getting paid to do what they're doing day in, day out. So to try and still do that and hold a job down, I've so much admiration for people who do it. But I really think it's about time that women's sport was funded to an equal level, really.
Mm.
Um, and having that whole array of professional physiologists, physios, sports psychologists, all of that sort of really top coaching team around you should be available to any of the women's teams competing at those higher and elite levels, really. So yeah, I was so proud of the women in the World Cup. I just want them to keep going in that vein, but also want them to be supported better and have that opportunity to really compete against the New Zealand and Australian teams who have got so much more funding than we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way women's sports going, they're going to have to invest, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because of the heights and the fact that it's now more on television and the coverage and the sponsorship that will come in.
Yeah,
It's particularly rugby league. I think they're on a really hiatus for greatness if we get it right.
yeah. And I would be wrong if I didn't mention the wheelchair rugby league as well, because I love
Absolutely, yeah.
the idea that you can also play in mixed arenas as well with different ages and so on. That blew me away in terms of its equality and diversity. I mean, it was super, and a great spectacle to watch as well. So I really hope lots of women get more involved with the wheelchair rugby league as well.
Yeah, yeah. It is a great opportunity, isn't it? And
Mm,
the legacy the Rugby League World Cup has left is with us, and you can tangibly feel it. And I know as a woman, it's the first time I've ever felt fully included in a sport that I've been involved with for 40 years, but I actually felt
yeah.
included and part of it, and that I had a place and a part to play in it, which I think is a true legacy, isn't it?
Yeah, well, all pioneers like you, Julie. When you think that you'd often be the only woman in a huge group of men, it's fantastic then to see the BBC having all those trailers for that documentary, covering the games, and lots of people exposed to women's rugby league who've never seen it before. So
Mm.
it was a great platform. I just hope that we use that platform so that we can, really help people. Because I think with that additional sort of level of funding and support, it doesn't just benefit that elite level, it benefits it all the way down to grassroots and gets the girls playing, doesn't it? It gets
Yeah.
people saying, well, I want to be like that woman I've just seen on television. I want to go and do that as well.
And there's nothing better hearing than a girl says, "I want to play like," and the role model's female
Yeah.
or a woman, because so often in our childhoods, we just never had
No.
women role models, did we, in order to aspire to. So it's lovely to begin to see and then being able to have them, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Claire, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. And talking of pioneers, you were well before your time with sports psychology. And as I say, as I've been looking back, it's been like, wow, we really did all of that. And I think the Great Britain women, when you look at the sports science, not just the psychology, but all the sports
Yeah.
science they did, the conditioning, and the different things that they added to these women around diet and nutrition and everything. There wasn't some of the professional teams weren't doing it, so they were well before the time, and you played a big part in that. So thank you for that, and thank you for agreeing to be interviewed.
Thanks very much, Julia. Always nice to talk to you.